The blood-soaked telegram shook in Rebecca Reynolds' trembling hands as she stood on the dusty main street of Beaver, Utah Territory, in 1875. The message confirmed her worst fears. Her father's cattle ranch, the only inheritance she had left, had been stolen through falsified documents while she'd been away in St. Louis. No one believed her claims that Marcus Holloway, the territory's wealthiest cattle baron, had orchestrated the theft. No one except the tall, enigmatic cowboy watching her from across the street. Rebecca folded the telegram carefully, tucking it into the pocket of her traveling skirt. 3 weeks ago, she'd been preparing to return to Utah after receiving news of her father's passing. What should have been a sorrowful but straightforward homecoming had twisted into something far darker. "Miss, you look like you could use a hand," came a deep voice from behind her. Rebecca turned to find herself staring up at a man whose features seemed carved from the harsh landscape itself, weathered but handsome, with eyes the color of a summer sky. The silver star pinned to his leather vest caught the afternoon sun. "Deputy," she began cautiously. "Blake Westwood, madam, deputy of Beaver County." He tipped his hat. "Couldn't help but notice you seem troubled." Rebecca glanced around nervously. Main Street bustled with afternoon activity, merchants closing shops, cowboys heading toward the saloons, ladies hurrying to finish errands before supper. Nobody seemed to be watching them, but Rebecca had learned the hard way that Holloway had eyes everywhere. "I appreciate your concern, Deputy Westwood, but I've already spoken with Sheriff Morris. He made his position quite clear." The deputy frowned. "That being, that a woman traveling alone must be confused about property law, that perhaps my grief is clouding my judgment. That Marcus Holloway is a respected businessman whose word carries far more weight than mine." Rebecca couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice. Blake Westwood's expression remained unreadable, but something flickered behind his eyes. "Miss Reynolds, isn't it? Henry Reynolds' daughter." She nodded, surprised. "I knew your father. Honest man. Good rancher." The deputy looked thoughtful. "Tell you what, the sheriff might not have time to hear you out properly, but I do. Why don't you join me for coffee at the cafe yonder and tell me your story? No promises, but I'll listen." Rebecca hesitated. Her instinct was to refuse. What good would it do? But something in the deputy's straightforward manner sparked a tiny flame of hope she thought had been extinguished. "Very well, Deputy Westwood. Coffee it is." The cafe was mercifully quiet at this hour. They claimed a corner table, and Blake ordered coffee for them both. When the cups arrived, Rebecca wrapped her fingers around the warm porcelain, gathering her thoughts. "My father wrote to me in St. Louis 3 months ago. He mentioned pressure to sell the ranch to Holloway, but he refused. The land had been in our family since before the territory was established. Then 6 weeks ago, I received word he'd died heart failure, they said." She paused, sipping the bitter coffee. "By the time I could arrange passage west, I received another letter informing me the ranch had been legally transferred to the Holloway Cattle Company weeks before my father's death. The documents bore his signature." "And you believe the signature was forged?" Blake asked, his eyes never leaving her face. "I know it was. My father would never sell, especially not to Holloway, and the date on the deed." Rebecca leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Deputy, my father was in Salt Lake City on business the day he supposedly signed that document. I have proof, a receipt from a hotel there, dated the same day." Blake nodded thoughtfully. "That's something concrete. What did Sheriff Morris say about that?" "He said the receipt could be forged, or that my father could have signed before leaving or after returning." Rebecca's knuckles whitened around her cup. "What he really meant was that my word against Holloway's is no contest at all. And you've no other family to back your claim." Rebecca shook her head. "My mother died when I was 12. No siblings. I was teaching at a ladies' academy in St. Louis." My father wanted me to have education and opportunity beyond what Beaver could offer. Yet you came back. It's still home, and now it's been stolen from me." Blake Westwood took a long drink of his coffee, his expression contemplative. Finally, he set the cup down with deliberate care. "Miss Reynolds, I've been deputy here for 3 years. In that time, I've heard whispers about Holloway's business practices, but nothing that could be proven. The sheriff," he paused. "Sheriff Morris and Holloway have known each other since boyhood. Their friendship colors his judgment." Rebecca felt a flicker of vindication at this confirmation of her suspicions. "However," Blake continued, "accusing a man like Marcus Holloway requires more than suspicion and circumstantial evidence. It needs solid proof." Rebecca's momentary hope dimmed. "So you're saying what everyone else has, that I should give up?" To her surprise, Blake Westwood's face broke into a smile that transformed his rugged features. "Not at all, Miss Reynolds. I'm saying we need to find that proof." He leaned forward. "I believe you." Those 3 simple words hit Rebecca with unexpected force. After weeks of dismissal, condescension, and outright hostility, someone finally believed her. "You do? But why?" she whispered, suddenly finding it hard to speak past the lump in her throat. "Because Henry Reynolds was an honest man who loved that land. Because the timing of his death and the property transfer is suspicious, to say the least. And because, Miss Reynolds, I've been watching Holloway for a long time, waiting for a chance to prove what I suspect about him." Blake's voice hardened. "This might be that chance. What do you suggest we do? First, I need to see that hotel receipt and any other documents you have. Then we need to talk to people who might have seen your father during those critical days, the doctor who pronounced his death, neighbors who might have noticed strangers around the property." Rebecca felt a surge of determination. "I have the receipt in my room at the boarding house." As for neighbors, the closest was old Mr. Finch, but his eyesight is poor. The ranch's was quite isolated. "That's why Holloway wanted it," Blake mused. "It borders his northern pastures and controls access to Beaver Creek's best water rights." "Exactly. My father always said that water would be worth its weight in gold someday." Blake nodded. "Miss Reynolds, this won't be easy or quick. Holloway has power, money, and influence throughout the county." "I understand the risks, Deputy Westwood." "Blake," he corrected. "If we're going to work together on this, you might as well call me Blake." "Then I'm Rebecca." She offered her hand and he took it. His palm was calloused but warm, his grip firm yet gentle. "Rebecca," he repeated, and something in the way he said her name made her pulse quicken. "I can't make any promises about the outcome, but I give you my word. I'll help you find the truth." For the first time since receiving news of her father's death, Rebecca felt something other than grief and anger. It was too fragile to call hope, but it was a beginning. "Thank you," she said simply. Neither realized their hands were still joined until the cafe owner approached with the coffee pot. They separated quickly, Rebecca feeling a blush rise to her cheeks. "I should get those documents for you," she said, rising. "I'll walk you to the boarding house," Blake offered, placing coins on the table. "If Holloway has eyes in town as you suspect, it's better not to be alone." Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows down Beaver's Main Street. Rebecca was acutely aware of Blake's presence beside her, his height and breadth somehow reassuring rather than intimidating. They walked in comfortable silence until reaching Mrs. Gunderson's boarding house for respectable ladies. "I'll wait here," Blake said at the front gate. "Best not to give Mrs. Gunderson anything to gossip about." Rebecca smiled despite herself. "A wise precaution. I'll only be a moment." In her sparse room, Rebecca retrieved the hotel receipt from her father's last trip to Salt Lake City, along with the letters he'd sent her in the months before his death. She paused, then added the small leather journal she'd found among his personal effects when she'd been allowed a brief visit to collect personal items only from the ranch. When she returned to the gate, Blake was speaking with a young boy who darted away as she approached. "Trouble?" she asked. "Just sending word that I'll be occupied with official business this evening," Blake explained. "Now, let's find somewhere quiet to look through these papers." They settled on a small church garden, empty at this hour but public enough to be respectable for a deputy and a single woman to converse. As the setting sun painted the sky in fiery hues, Rebecca watched Blake methodically review each document, his expression growing increasingly thoughtful. "Your father was clearly concerned about Holloway's interest in the property," he noted, referencing the letters. "And he specifically writes here that he would sooner see the ranch burn than fall into Marcus's hands. That's strong sentiment." "They had history," Rebecca explained. "Years ago, before I left for school, Holloway tried to court me. He was already twice widowed and 20 years my senior. My father intervened when Holloway became insistent." Blake's jaw tightened. "I see. I always suspected the interest in our land became more pressing after that rejection, though my father never confirmed it." Blake turned to the journal, carefully examining the entries from the months before Henry Reynolds' death. "Your father meticulously documented every interaction with Holloway and his men," he said with growing excitement. "He mentions encounters, threats, even suspected sabotage of fences and a poisoned watering hole." He was building a case, Rebecca realized, but against whom specifically? Holloway is careful to keep his hands clean. That's what we need to discover. Blake closed the journal. "These final entries mention a man named Curtis Benton, Holloway's new foreman. Your father seemed particularly suspicious of him." Rebecca frowned. "I don't recall the name. He came to town about a year ago. Rumor has it he's done enforcement work for cattle interests in Wyoming. The kind that doesn't involve much legal paperwork." Blake's expression was grim. If Holloway wanted something unsavory done, Benton would be his man. The church bell tolled the evening hour, startling them both. "It's getting late," Blake said, returning the documents to Rebecca. "Tomorrow I'll make some inquiries about Benton's whereabouts around the time of your father's death. Meanwhile, keep these safe." "What should I do?" Rebecca asked, unwilling to be sidelined. Blake considered her question. "Do you still have friends in town, anyone you trust completely?" "Clara Wilson, now Clara Patterson. We grew up together. Her husband owns the Mercantile." "Perfect. Visit her tomorrow. Casually ask if she remembers anything unusual around the time of your father's death. People talk to shopkeepers, especially the wives." Rebecca nodded, tucking the precious documents into her bag. "I can do that." Blake escorted her back to the boarding house, their steps slowing as they approached. "Rebecca," he said quietly, "be careful. If Holloway suspects were investigating, he won't hesitate to act. Don't go anywhere alone if you can help it, especially not out to the ranch." "I understand," she replied, touched by his concern. "Thank you again, Blake, for believing me when no one else would." "Sometimes," he said with a smile that softened his weathered features, "a person just needs one ally to find their way to the truth." As Rebecca watched him walk away into the gathering dusk, she wondered if perhaps she'd found more than just an ally. Morning arrived with a clarity that seemed to mirror Rebecca's renewed sense of purpose. At breakfast in the boarding house dining room, she carefully avoided questions from the other ladies about her meeting with the deputy. Mrs. Gunderson, a widow with eagle eyes and a sharper tongue, seemed particularly interested. "Official business, was it?" she inquired, refilling Rebecca's coffee cup with deliberate slowness. "Yes, madam," Rebecca replied evenly. "Deputy Westwood is helping me sort through some matters related to my father's estate." Mrs. Gunderson hummed skeptically. "The deputy's a fine man. Unmarried, you know. one of the few eligible men in Beaver with both principles and prospects. Rebecca felt her cheeks warm. I'm sure that's of interest to many ladies, but my concerns are strictly related to my father's property. Mrs. Gunderson's knowing smile suggested she believed otherwise, but thankfully, she moved on to interrogate another boarder about a package that had arrived. After breakfast, Rebecca made her way to Patterson's Mercantile on Main Street. The familiar bell above the door jingled as she entered, bringing a rush of childhood memories. Clara Patterson looked up from arranging fabric bolts and squealed in delight. Rebecca Reynolds. I heard you were back in town, but I'd begun to think you were avoiding your old friends. Clara rushed around the counter to embrace her. Rebecca returned the hug warmly. Despite 5 years of separation, Clara's friendly face was wonderfully familiar, the same heart-shaped face and dimpled smile, though now framed by a more matronly hairstyle. I've been preoccupied, Rebecca admitted, but I should have come sooner. Nonsense. I understand completely. Losing your father and then all this business with the ranch, Clara broke off, looking embarrassed. I'm sorry. That was tactless of me. It's all right, Rebecca assured her. Actually, that's partly why I came. I'm trying to piece together what happened in those last days. Clara glanced around the empty store and lowered her voice. Come to the back room. Thomas is making deliveries this morning, so we can talk privately. The storeroom was cramped but neat, with a small table where the Pattersons presumably took their meals. Clara poured tea from a pot kept warm on a small stove and gestured for Rebecca to sit. I'm so sorry about your father, Clara began. It was shocking, he always seemed so robust. Thank you. Rebecca sipped her tea. Clara, did you see my father in the days before he died? Clara nodded. He came into the store 3 days before it happened. Bought supplies for a month as usual, seemed in good spirits. She hesitated. Though he did have words with Curtis Benton right outside the store. Rebecca's pulse quickened. What sort of words? I couldn't hear exactly. Your father looked angry, and Benton had that nasty smile he always wears. Thomas went to the door, worried there might be trouble, but they separated. Thomas said your father told him to watch himself around Holloway's attacked dog. Did anything else unusual happen around that time? Any strangers in town? Clara thought carefully. There was a man, a doctor, I think. Not Dr. Miller, but someone from up north. Stayed at the hotel for 2 nights. Left the morning they found your father. A visiting doctor present just when her father supposedly died of natural causes. Rebecca tried to keep her expression neutral. Did you get his name? No, but Mrs. Ellis at the hotel might remember. She keeps meticulous guest records. Rebecca nodded, filing away this information. What about after my father died? Did Holloway or his men come into town more frequently? Thomas noticed several of Holloway's men celebrating at the saloon the night after the funeral. Seemed inappropriate, he said. Clara leaned forward. Rebecca, what's going on? People are saying you're making trouble challenging the property transfer. I am, Rebecca admitted. Because it's fraudulent, Clara. My father would never sell to Holloway, and I can prove he wasn't even in Beaver the day he supposedly signed the deed. Clara's eyes widened. That's a serious accusation. Marcus Holloway is a powerful man, I know, but I have help now. Rebecca hesitated, then decided to trust her old friend. Deputy Westwood believes me. Understanding dawned on Clara's face. Ah, the deputy. I've seen how he looks at lawbreakers like a hawk watching field mice. If he's on your side, Holloway might have reason to worry. The bell jingled from the front store and Clara rose. That'll be Mrs. Whitman for her weekly order. Let me help her, then we can continue. Left alone, Rebecca pondered this new information. A visiting doctor, Holloway's men celebrating, and the confrontation between her father and Benton, pieces of a puzzle were emerging, but the complete picture remained elusive. Clara returned a few minutes later, looking troubled. Mrs. Whitman just mentioned something odd. She lives near your father's property line, and she says she's seen men surveying the land already. Holloway's not wasting any time. He's afraid I might succeed in challenging the deed, Rebecca realized. He wants to establish his claim as quickly as possible. Be careful, Rebecca. People who cross Marcus Holloway tend to regret it. I don't have much choice. That land is my home and my livelihood. Rebecca finished her tea and stood. Thank you, Clara. This has been helpful. Will you come for supper soon? Thomas would love to see you, and we have a little one now, Samuel, nearly 2 years old. Rebecca smiled genuinely. I'd like that very much. Outside the mercantile, Rebecca squinted in the bright sunlight, considering her next move. The hotel was just down the street, and Mrs. Ellis might provide more information about the mysterious doctor. She was so focused on her thoughts that she didn't notice the man approaching until he spoke. Miss Reynolds, what a pleasant surprise. The voice sent an unpleasant chill down her spine. Marcus Holloway stood before her, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that emphasized his still impressive physique, despite his 50 years. His silver-streaked dark hair and meticulously groomed beard gave him a distinguished appearance that belied the coldness in his eyes. Mr. Holloway, she acknowledged stiffly, I have nothing to say to you. Come now, Rebecca, we're practically neighbors. Or rather, I'm now the proud owner of what was once your father's modest operation. His smile didn't reach his eyes. I was sorry to hear about your dissatisfaction with the arrangement. Arrangement? You mean theft through forgery, Rebecca countered, glancing around. The street was busy with midday traffic. Whatever Holloway might say, he wouldn't risk a scene. His smile hardened. Careful, my dear. Such accusations without proof could be considered slander. I have the deed, properly signed and witnessed. A deed my father couldn't possibly have signed on that date. We both know that, Mr. Holloway. Something dangerous flashed in his eyes. What I know is that a young woman, alone in the world, might be better served accepting a generous settlement rather than pursuing baseless claims. I'd still be willing to offer you a sum for your cooperation. I'm not interested in your money. Holloway stepped closer, his voice dropping. Then perhaps you'd be interested in your continued well-being. Beaver can be a dangerous place for a woman without protection. Before Rebecca could respond, a deep voice interrupted. Is there a problem here? Blake Westwood materialized beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. The silver deputy's star on his chest caught the sunlight. Holloway's expression smoothed into practiced cordiality. Deputy Westwood, no problem at all. Just welcoming Miss Reynolds back to Beaver and expressing my condolences on her loss. How thoughtful, Blake replied, his tone neutral but his eyes watchful. Miss Reynolds, I believe we had an appointment to discuss those documents. Rebecca gratefully took the lifeline. Yes, Deputy, I was just on my way. Holloway, Blake nodded curtly to the older man, Deputy. Holloway's smile remained fixed, but his eyes had turned calculating as they flicked between Rebecca and Blake. Miss Reynolds, do consider my offer. It won't remain open indefinitely. He tipped his hat and continued down the street, stopping to exchange pleasantries with the mayor outside the bank. Are you all right? Blake asked once Holloway was out of earshot. Rebecca realized she was trembling slightly. Yes, he was just trying to intimidate me. What did he say exactly? She recounted the brief conversation, including the thinly veiled threat. Blake's jaw tightened. He's worried, the deputy concluded. He wouldn't approach you directly otherwise. He guided her toward a quieter side street. I've learned some interesting things this morning. So have I, Rebecca replied, and shared what Clara had told her about the strange doctor and the confrontation between her father and Benton. Blake nodded, his expression serious. That fits with what I've discovered. I spoke with Dr. Miller, who was supposedly called to your father's ranch by a ranch hand who found him collapsed. Dr. Miller admitted he only examined your father briefly before signing the death certificate. The cause of death, heart failure, was suggested by a visiting physician who happened to be present. The same Dr. Clara mentioned, almost certainly. Dr. Miller described him as an older gentleman from Salt Lake City, but couldn't recall his name, said the man offered professional courtesy in a difficult situation. That's suspicious in itself, Rebecca noted. And I've never heard of any ranch hand on my father's property. He managed alone since I left for school, hiring seasonal help only during roundup and branding. Exactly. No one can identify this mysterious ranch hand who supposedly found your father. Blake lowered his voice further. I also learned that Curtis Benton was seen riding in the direction of your father's ranch the evening before his body was discovered. A cold knot formed in Rebecca's stomach. You think Benton killed my father? I think it's a distinct possibility, but proving it is another matter entirely. They'd reached the sheriff's office, a sturdy building with barred windows and a small jail attached to the back. Blake hesitated at the door. Sheriff Morris is inside. He should hear what we've learned, Blake said, though his tone suggested he didn't expect a favorable reception. Will he listen? Probably not, but we need to do this properly. Besides, I want him to know I'm officially investigating. It might make Holloway think twice about any further threats. Inside, Sheriff Arthur Morris sat behind a desk cluttered with papers, a half-eaten lunch, and a neglected stack of wanted posters. He was a heavy-set man with a florid complexion that spoke of too many evenings at the saloon. He looked up with irritation when they entered. Westwood, where have you been? Perkins was by looking for you earlier. His gaze shifted to Rebecca and his expression soured further. Miss Reynolds. Sheriff, she acknowledged coolly. Blake stood straight, his demeanor professional. Sheriff Morris, I'm officially opening an investigation into the circumstances surrounding Henry Reynolds' death and the subsequent transfer of his property. The sheriff's bushy eyebrows shot up. On whose authority? Mine, as deputy with investigative responsibilities. We have reasonable cause to suspect foul play. Morris's face darkened. This again? I thought I made myself clear, Miss Reynolds. The matter is settled. Your father signed the deed, witnessed by Judge Pemberton himself. My father was in Salt Lake City on the day he supposedly signed that deed, Rebecca countered, producing the hotel receipt. This proves it. The sheriff barely glanced at the document. That proves nothing except that someone stayed at a hotel. Could be anyone's name scrawled there. Blake stepped forward. There's more, Sheriff. A mysterious doctor present at Henry's death, Holloway's men celebrating afterward, and Curtis Benton seen riding toward the Reynolds ranch the evening before. Coincidences and gossip, Morris dismissed. Not evidence of wrongdoing. Aren't they at least worth investigating? Blake pressed. The sheriff rose, his chair scraping loudly. Now you listen here, Westwood. Marcus Holloway is a pillar of this community. These wild accusations could damage the town's reputation and development prospects. I won't have it. With respect, sir, my job is to uphold the law, not protect reputations. Morris's face flushed deeper. Your job is to do as I instruct, and I'm instructing you to drop this nonsense. Miss Reynolds is understandably distraught over her father's passing, but that doesn't justify dragging a good man's name through the mud. Rebecca had heard enough. A good man. Holloway threatened me on Main Street not 30 minutes ago. He what? Blake turned to her, alarm evident in his expression. Nonsense, Morris sputtered. Marcus wouldn't. He suggested it would be dangerous for me to continue pursuing my claim, Rebecca cut in. I consider that a threat, Sheriff. Morris waved dismissively. You misunderstood. Marcus has always had a special regard for you. Everyone knows that. The implication made Rebecca's skin crawl. Blake's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. Sheriff, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Regardless of your personal friendships, threats against citizens of this county must be taken seriously. I'm continuing this investigation. You can support me or not, but I'm seeing it through. Morris stared at Blake for a long moment, then shook his head. You're making a grave mistake, Deputy, one that could cost you your badge. Then so be it, Blake replied evenly. The tension in the room was palpable. Finally, Morris huffed and sat back down. Do what you want, Westwood. But don't come crying when Holloway files a complaint with the county commissioners, and don't expect me to back you. Understood, Blake said, guiding Rebecca toward the door. We'll keep you informed of our findings. Outside, Rebecca released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. That went about as well as expected. Actually, better than I thought, Blake admitted, guiding her down the boardwalk. He didn't fire me outright. Not yet, anyway. Rebecca glanced at him. Blake, I can't ask you to risk your position. You didn't ask, I offered. His blue eyes were steady on hers. Some things matter more than a badge, Rebecca. Justice is one of them. Something warm unfurled in her chest at his words. What's our next step? I think we need to visit your father's ranch, your ranch, he corrected himself. There might be evidence there that was overlooked or ignored. Rebecca's heart quickened at the thought of returning home, even under these circumstances. Holloway's men will be watching the property. Not if we go at first light tomorrow. Most ranch hands aren't early risers unless there's specific work scheduled. Blake looked thoughtful. We'll need horses. Clara's husband might lend us two. He keeps several for deliveries. Perfect. I'll speak with him this afternoon. Blake glanced at the sky. It's nearly noon. You should get something to eat, then perhaps visit the hotel to inquire about that doctor. What will you be doing? I need to check on something at the land office. Those property transfers leave paper trails. Blake hesitated. Rebecca, after what happened with Holloway today, I'm concerned about your safety. Perhaps you shouldn't be alone. I'll be careful and I'll stay in public places, she assured him. We'll accomplish more if we divide our tasks. He looked unconvinced but nodded. Meet me at the church garden at 4 o'clock. We'll compare what we've learned. They parted ways, Rebecca watching him stride purposefully toward the county offices. Despite the challenges ahead, she felt more hopeful than she had since returning to Beaver. In Blake Westwood, she'd found not just an ally but a man of principle, something increasingly rare in her experience. At the hotel, Mrs. Ellis proved to be a treasure trove of information, particularly when Rebecca explained she was working with Deputy Westwood on an official investigation. Oh yes, that doctor, Mrs. Ellis recalled, consulting her registry book. Dr. James Caldwell from Salt Lake City. Quiet gentleman, kept to himself mostly. Paid for 2 nights in advance but left after just one, early in the morning. The morning my father was found dead, Rebecca noted. Mrs. Ellis's eyes widened. Goodness, yes, I hadn't connected the timing. How peculiar. Did Dr. Caldwell mention his business in Beaver? Only that he was visiting a colleague. I assumed Dr. Miller. Mrs. Ellis leaned closer. Though now that you mention it, he did have a visitor the evening before he left. A rough-looking fellow who didn't come through the front entrance. I only saw him because I was checking the back door before retiring. Can you describe this man? Tall, dark-haired with a scar along his jawline. Wore range clothes but carried himself like a man used to giving orders, not taking them. Curtis Benton. The description matched what Rebecca had heard of Holloway's foreman. Thank you, Mrs. Ellis. This is very helpful. Rebecca hesitated. I'd appreciate if you'd keep our conversation private for now. The older woman nodded conspiratorially. Of course, dear. And may I say, it's high time someone looked into that business with your father's property. Never seemed right to me, him selling to Holloway after all those years of refusing. Armed with this new information, Rebecca felt a growing certainty that they were on the right track. She took a roundabout route back to the boarding house, conscious of Holloway's warning and the possibility of being followed. Once in her room, she recorded everything she'd learned in a small notebook, organizing the timeline of events surrounding her father's death. The pieces were beginning to form a disturbing picture. A forged deed, a confrontation between her father and Benton, a mysterious doctor with connections to Holloway's foreman, and the convenient timing of her father's natural death. Rebecca was more convinced than ever that her father had been murdered to facilitate the theft of his ranch. After a light lunch in the boarding house dining room, where she carefully deflected Mrs. Gunderson's probing questions, Rebecca decided to visit the cemetery before her meeting with Blake. She hadn't yet had the opportunity to properly pay her respects at her father's grave. The Beaver Cemetery lay on a gentle slope east of town, shaded by cottonwood trees that whispered in the afternoon breeze. Rebecca found her father's grave easily a fresh mound with a simple wooden marker. Standing before it, grief washed over her anew. "I'll make this right, Pa," she whispered. "I promise you that." She laid the wildflowers she'd gathered along the path on the grave, then knelt to clear away some weeds that had already begun to sprout. As she worked, she became aware of a presence behind her. Turning quickly, she found herself face to face with Curtis Benton. He was exactly as described, tall and dark-haired, with a jagged scar running along his right jawline. His eyes were cold as he looked down at her, one hand resting casually on the pistol at his hip. "Miss Reynolds," he drawled. Paying respects to the departed, Rebecca stood slowly, conscious of how isolated they were among the graves. "Mr. Benton, I presume? You've heard of me." "I'm flattered." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Seems you've been asking a lot of questions around town, making quite a nuisance of yourself." "I wasn't aware that seeking the truth was a nuisance," she replied, struggling to keep her voice steady. Benton stepped closer. "Truth is a funny thing, Miss Reynolds. Changes depending on who's telling it. Mr. Holloway's truth is that your pa sold his worthless plot of land fair and square before his unfortunate passing. And the real truth, Benton's smile widened unpleasantly. The real truth is that smart women know when to stop digging up the past, especially when the past is buried 6 feet under, like your pa there." The threat was unmistakable. Rebecca's heart hammered in her chest, but she refused to show fear. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Benton?" "Just offering friendly advice. That deputy you've got sniffing around, he can't protect you all the time." Benton glanced meaningfully at the isolated cemetery. "Some places are mighty lonely." "I'm not afraid of you," Rebecca stated, though it wasn't entirely true. Benton chuckled. "You should be, Miss Reynolds. You really should be." He tipped his hat mockingly. "Give my regards to Deputy Westwood. Tell him Curtis Benton said to mind his own business if he wants to keep wearing that star." He turned and sauntered away, leaving Rebecca trembling beside her father's grave. Once he disappeared among the trees, she gathered her skirts and hurried back toward town, fear and anger propelling her forward. Rebecca arrived at the church garden early, her encounter with Benton having driven her from the cemetery sooner than planned. She paced the small garden anxiously, jumping at every sound. Blake found her there 20 minutes later, his expression changing from greeting to concern when he saw her face. "What happened?" She recounted her confrontation with Benton, watching Blake's expression darken with each detail. "He threatened both of us then," Blake concluded grimly. "Benton's not known for empty threats. He as much as admitted my father was murdered," Rebecca said, "the way he spoke about the past being buried." Blake guided her to a bench beneath a flowering pear tree. "Benton's overconfident. That's good for us, he might slip up." He reached into his vest pocket. "I found something at the land office that might help." He produced a folded paper and opened it carefully. "This is a copy of the witness page for your father's deed transfer." Judge Pemberton witnessed it, along with the county clerk and a third man, Dr. James Caldwell. Rebecca's eyes widened. The doctor from the hotel. So he was involved in the forgery as well as covering up my father's murder. It appears so. And here's what's interesting: I checked records in Salt Lake City last month on an unrelated matter. There is no Dr. James Caldwell registered to practice medicine there. A fake doctor, Rebecca breathed. That explains why he left town so quickly after my father died. Blake nodded. I believe Holloway brought him in specifically for this purpose, to forge documents, provide a false witness, and certify a natural death. We need to find him, Rebecca said. I've already sent telegrams to contacts in Salt Lake City and Ogden. If this doctor has worked similar schemes before, someone might recognize the description. Blake covered her hand with his. Rebecca, with Benton making explicit threats, I don't think you should stay at the boarding house tonight. It's too exposed, and Mrs. Gunderson is too free with information about her boarders. Where should I go? Clara Patterson might take you in, but that could put her family at risk. Blake looked troubled. The safest place would be the jail cell, ironically, but Sheriff Morris would never allow it. I won't cower in a cell while Holloway and Benton roam free, Rebecca insisted. Blake's eyes softened. I know. I have another suggestion. My cabin is just outside town, simple but secure. I could stay in town tonight to keep an eye on Holloway and Benton while you'd be safely away from their reach. The impropriety of staying unchaperoned in a bachelor's home wasn't lost on Rebecca, but her safety outweighed social conventions. I think that would be wise, under the circumstances. Relief crossed Blake's features. Good. We should leave separately to avoid drawing attention. I'll take you there before sunset, then return to town to continue our investigation. As they finalized their plans, Rebecca found herself studying Blake's face, the determined set of his jaw, the intelligence in his blue eyes, the way his expression softened when he looked at her. In the midst of danger and uncertainty, she was discovering feelings she'd never expected to find in Beaver, Utah territory. The sun was low on the horizon when Blake's cabin came into view. Nestled among pine trees on a small rise overlooking Beaver Creek, the sturdy log structure was larger and more well-maintained than Rebecca had expected. It's beautiful, she remarked as they approached on horseback. It was my father's, Blake explained. He was one of the original settlers here. Built it with his own hands after the Army discharged him in '53. I've added to it over the years. A small corral and barn stood behind the cabin, and a vegetable garden flourished along one side. Everything spoke of care and attention to detail, like the man himself, Rebecca thought. Inside, the cabin was simple but comfortable. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a solid wooden table and chairs nearby. Bookshelves lined another wall, filled with volumes that surprised Rebecca with their variety: history, law, even poetry. You read Wordsworth? She asked, noticing a well-worn volume. Blake looked almost embarrassed. My mother was a schoolteacher before she married my father. She brought her books west and made sure I appreciated them. A deputy who quotes poetry. You're full of surprises, Blake Westwood. He smiled, revealing a dimple in his right cheek that transformed his serious face. There's more to most people than first appears, Miss Reynolds. He showed her the cabin's layout: a main room with the fireplace and cooking area, a small bedroom he insisted she take, and a lean-to addition where he normally slept. The cabin had luxuries Rebecca hadn't expected, including a pump bringing creek water directly to the kitchen area. I'll bring in more firewood and start a fire before I leave, Blake said. Nights get cool, even in summer. There's food in the pantry, nothing fancy, but you won't go hungry. Keep the doors bolted and... He hesitated, then opened a cabinet and removed a shotgun. Do you know how to use this? Rebecca took the weapon with familiar hands. My father taught me. I haven't forgotten. Blake nodded approvingly. I didn't think you had. Keep it close tonight, just in case. I don't expect trouble. Few people know about this place, but best to be prepared. As he prepared to leave, Rebecca felt a sudden reluctance to see him go. Blake, she said impulsively, please be careful. Benton and Holloway are dangerous men. He turned at the door, his expression softening. I'm always careful, Rebecca. He hesitated, then added, but it's nice to have someone worry about me for a change. After he left, Rebecca bolted the door as instructed and took stock of her temporary refuge. The cabin revealed much about its owner, the books showing his intellect, the craftsmanship of the furniture speaking to his skill with his hands, the carefully tended garden suggesting patience and care. Everything neat, orderly, and thoughtful, like the man himself. She prepared a simple supper from the provisions Blake had indicated, surprised at how well stocked his pantry was. As darkness fell, she sat by the fire, the shotgun within reach, and opened her father's journal again. Reading his words brought both comfort and renewed determination. Henry Reynolds had been a good man, honest, hardworking, and principled. He deserved justice, and Rebecca would see that he received it. A sound outside startled her from her reading. Just an owl, she realized with relief. Still, the isolated location, so comforting in daylight, felt vulnerable in darkness. Every creak of the cabin's timbers, every rustle in the surrounding forest made her reach for the shotgun. To distract herself, Rebecca returned to the bookshelves, selecting a volume of Tennyson's poetry. She smiled, wondering if Blake had chosen it for the adventure tales or the romantic verses. Perhaps both sides appealed to him, the man of action and the thoughtful reader. Eventually, exhaustion overcame her wariness, and Rebecca retired to Blake's bedroom. The simple space was immaculately kept, with a handmade quilt covering the bed and a small table holding a Bible and a daguerreotype of an older couple, Blake's parents, she presumed. She ran her fingers lightly over the image, wondering what they had been like, these people who had raised such a remarkable son. Sleep claimed her quickly, but it was fitful, filled with dreams of her father calling for help while shadowy figures pursued her through endless corridors. She woke before dawn, momentarily disoriented in the unfamiliar room until memory returned. Rebecca rose, washed her face in the basin of water she'd prepared the night before, and dressed quickly. She and Blake had agreed to meet at first light to ride to her father's ranch. Stepping into the main room, she stoked the fire and put coffee on to boil, taking comfort in these ordinary morning tasks. A soft knock at the door startled her. Drawing the shotgun from where she'd leaned it against the table, Rebecca approached cautiously. "Who's there?" she called. "It's Blake," came the response, and she immediately lowered the weapon, unbolting the door. Blake stood on the porch, looking tired but alert. His eyes went immediately to the shotgun in her hand, and he nodded approvingly. "Good. You're being cautious." "Did you learn anything in town last night?" Rebecca asked, stepping aside to let him enter. "Nothing concrete, but Holloway's men were drinking heavily at the saloon, including Benton. They seemed to be celebrating something." Blake accepted the cup of coffee she offered with a grateful smile. "Also, I received a reply to one of my telegrams. Our Dr. Caldwell has worked similar schemes in Colorado and Wyoming. His real name is Edwin Porter, and he's wanted in Denver for practicing medicine without a license. So we have proof he's a fraud," Rebecca said hopefully. "Yes, but not proof that he forged documents or helped murder your father." Blake sipped his coffee. "For that we need more evidence, which is why our visit to the ranch is so important." They finished their coffee quickly, then prepared for the ride. Blake had brought provisions for the day, and Rebecca packed her father's journal, thinking it might contain clues they'd overlooked. As dawn broke, they set out, taking a roundabout route to avoid being seen from town. The ride took nearly 2 hours, during which they discussed strategy. Rebecca felt a growing certainty that if her father had suspected foul play, he would have left evidence somewhere on the ranch, perhaps something that his killers hadn't found. He had hiding places throughout the house, she explained. Secret compartments in furniture, loose floorboards. Pa was always cautious, especially after my mother died. Said a man with something to protect needed to be prepared. Blake nodded thoughtfully. Smart man. Let's hope he left something that can help us. As they crested a ridge, the Reynolds ranch came into view in the valley below. Rebecca felt a painful constriction in her chest at the sight of her childhood home, a substantial log house with a wide porch, flanked by a barn, corral, and several outbuildings. Smoke rose from the chimney, indicating someone was in residence. Holloway's men, Blake murmured. 2 horses in the corral, not a full crew yet, but enough to be problematic. Rebecca pointed to a stand of cottonwoods to the east. There's a trail through those trees that leads to the back of the property. We can approach from there without being seen from the house. Blake looked impressed. Lead the way. They circled wide, keeping to the cover of trees and gullies until they reached the cottonwood grove. From there, they could see the back of the barn but remained hidden from the main house. The bunkhouse is empty, Rebecca noted, indicating a smaller building beyond the barn. They must be staying in the main house. Convenient for us, Blake replied. What's our best point of entry if we want to avoid being seen? There's a cellar entrance on the far side of the house. It leads directly to the kitchen. Rebecca dismounted, tying her horse to a tree. But first, let's check the barn. Pa often kept important documents hidden there, away from the house. They left the horses secured and moved cautiously toward the barn, staying low and using the uneven terrain for cover. The large structure was silent as they approached, its double doors partially open. Blake gestured for Rebecca to stay back while he peered inside. Empty, he whispered, and they slipped in, closing the doors behind them. The familiar sense of hay, leather, and horses enveloped Rebecca, bringing a wave of memories. Everything looked much as it had when she left for St. Louis. Her father had been meticulous about his equipment and tools, each with its proper place. What are we looking for specifically? Blake asked, keeping his voice low. There's a loose board in the tack room wall. Pa kept a strongbox behind it. Rebecca led the way to a small room at the rear of the barn. Inside, saddles were arranged on racks with bridles and other tack hanging neatly from pegs. Rebecca went directly to the back wall and pressed on a board that appeared no different from the others. It gave slightly, and she worked her fingers around the edge to pull it free. Behind it was a small cavity and the metal strongbox exactly where she remembered it. Heart pounding with excitement, she pulled it out and set it on a nearby bench. It's locked, Blake observed. The key should be. Rebecca felt along the top of the window frame above the bench. Here. She retrieved a small iron key that had been hidden in a notch. The lock turned smoothly, and Rebecca lifted the lid. Inside were several documents, deeds, bank records, her mother's marriage certificate, and a sealed envelope addressed in her father's handwriting. To be opened in the event of my unnatural death. Rebecca's hands trembled as she broke the seal. Blake moved closer, his shoulder touching hers as they both bent to read by the light filtering through the barn's dusty windows. The letter inside was dated just 2 weeks before Henry Reynolds died. To whom it may concern, if you are reading this, I have likely met with foul play at the hands of Marcus Holloway or his agents. For months, Holloway has pressured me to sell my ranch, using first money, then threats. Recently, his foreman, Curtis Benton, made it clear that if I continue to refuse, I might suffer an accident. I have documented every interaction with Holloway and his men in my personal journal, kept in my bedroom. Additionally, I have gathered evidence of Holloway's other illegal activities, including cattle rustling and intimidation of smaller ranchers. This evidence is hidden in the false bottom of the flour barrel in my kitchen. Should anything happen to me, I entrust this information to my daughter, Rebecca, or to any honest lawman who might investigate my death. Henry Reynolds' Rebecca looked up at Blake, her eyes bright with unshed tears. This is it proof that my father feared for his life because of Holloway. Blake nodded grimly. It's a start, but we need the other evidence. He mentioned both the journal and whatever's hidden in the kitchen. The journal is in my possession already, Rebecca said. I found it among his personal effects, but the kitchen. She glanced toward the house. We'll need to get inside without alerting Holloway's men. How many flour barrels would be in the kitchen? Blake asked. Just one, a large one by the stove. Blake considered their options. We could wait until they leave, but there's no guarantee both men will go at once. Or we could create a diversion. Before they could decide, voices outside the barn froze them in place. Two men were approaching, their conversation becoming clearer as they neared. Holloway wants the north pasture fenced by the end of the week, one voice said. Says he's bringing in 200 head from his southern range. Lots of work for just the two of us, the second man grumbled. When's the rest of the crew getting here? Tomorrow, supposedly. Benton's bringing them up. From the voice cut off as the barn door creaked open. Blake reacted instantly, pushing Rebecca behind a stack of hay bales while drawing his pistol. They crouched, barely breathing, as footsteps entered the barn. Grab those fence posts and the hammer, the first voice instructed. I'll get the wire from the back. The footsteps came closer to their hiding place. Rebecca's heart hammered so loudly she was certain it would give them away. Blake's arm around her shoulders kept her still. One of the men entered the tack room, moving directly to a shelf where tools were stored. Through a small gap between hay bales, Rebecca could see a young cowboy, perhaps 20, reaching for a hammer. For one terrifying moment she thought he would turn and see them, but he grabbed the tool and left, whistling tunelessly. They waited, tense and silent, until both men had gathered their supplies and exited the barn. Even then, Blake held Rebecca in place for several long minutes, ensuring the men had truly gone. That was close, he whispered finally, releasing her. They'll be working on the north pasture, which gives us an opportunity, but we need to move quickly. Rebecca returned the strongbox to its hiding place, keeping only her father's letter, and replaced the loose board. They slipped out of the barn, staying low and watching the two cowboys walk toward the northern edge of the property, tools in hand. Now's our chance, Blake said. Show me the cellar entrance. They circled behind the house, keeping close to an irrigation ditch that provided cover. The cellar doors were partially hidden by overgrown shrubs. Clearly, Holloway's men hadn't been using this entrance. Rebecca pulled the doors open, wincing at the slight creak of hinges that needed oil. The cellar was cool and dark, smelling of earth and preserved foods. Rebecca led the way up the narrow stairs to the kitchen door, pausing to listen before slowly opening it. The kitchen was empty, sunlight streaming through windows onto the familiar wooden table where she'd taken countless meals with her father. Everything looked unchanged, except for the dirty dishes piled in the sink. Her father would never have left such a mess. Blake followed her inside, closing the door quietly behind them. Where's the flour barrel? Rebecca pointed to a large wooden barrel beside the cast iron stove. Blake moved to it, removing the lid carefully to avoid making noise. Inside was half a barrel of flour. How do we access the false bottom without making a mess? Blake whispered. Rebecca considered the problem, then went to a cupboard and retrieved a large bowl. We'll need to remove some flour first. They worked quickly, transferring flour to the bowl until Blake could reach the bottom of the barrel. He ran his fingers around the edge, finding a small indentation. Pressing it, he was rewarded with a click as the false bottom released. Beneath it was a packet of papers wrapped in oilskin to protect them from moisture. Blake extracted it carefully, brushing flour from the wrapping before opening it. Inside were several documents, receipts, letters, and most significantly, a detailed ledger that appeared to track cattle numbers and brands. Rebecca examined it, her eyes widening. This shows Holloway was rustling cattle from ranches across the county, including ours. Pa recorded dates, numbers of cattle missing, and even witnessed accounts from cowboys who'd seen Holloway's men changing brands. Blake nodded. And here's correspondence between your father and the territorial marshal about his suspicions. He was building a case against Holloway for multiple crimes, which is why Holloway needed him silenced, Rebecca concluded bitterly. A floorboard creaked overhead. Someone was moving around on the second floor. Blake quickly gathered the evidence, wrapping it back in the oilskin. "We need to leave," he whispered. "We have what we came for." They replaced the flour and sealed the barrel, returning everything to its original state before slipping back down to the cellar. As they emerged outside, Rebecca felt a mixture of relief and sadness at leaving her home once more. Someday, she promised herself, she would return for good. They retrieved their horses and rode away as they had come, using the cottonwood grove for cover. Once safely away from the ranch, they stopped to examine their findings more thoroughly. "This is more than enough to justify arresting Holloway and Benton," Blake said, reviewing the documents. "Even Sheriff Morris can't ignore evidence this substantial." "Do you really believe he'll act on it?" Rebecca asked skeptically. Blake's expression was grim. "He may not have a choice. If he refuses, I'll take it directly to the territorial judge in Cedar City. This goes beyond beaver now rustling and murder are territorial matters. What's our next step? We return to town and confront Sheriff Morris with what we've found. The sooner Holloway and Benton are behind bars, the safer you'll be." Blake secured the evidence in his saddlebags. "Are you ready for this, Rebecca? It won't be easy, and Holloway won't go down without a fight." Rebecca straightened in her saddle, her face set with determination. "I've been ready since the moment I received that telegram about my father's death. Let's finish this." They rode toward town, each lost in thought. The morning sun climbed higher, promising another hot day. Rebecca found herself watching Blake, his strong profile against the blue sky, the capable hands holding the reins, the quiet confidence he exuded. In the midst of chaos and danger, he had become her anchor. As they approached Beaver, Blake suggested they stop at his cabin first to prepare their case and ensure the evidence was properly organized. Sheriff Morris will look for any excuse to dismiss these charges. We need to present everything clearly and irrefutably. At the cabin, they spread the documents across Blake's table, arranging them in logical order. First, the evidence of Holloway's cattle rustling, then the documentation of threats against Henry Reynolds, followed by the letter anticipating his murder, and finally, the proof of the fraudulent deed transfer. "It's a solid case," Blake said finally. "Even without locating this Edwin Porter, we have enough to arrest Holloway and Benton and invalidate the property transfer." Rebecca nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "My father would be grateful for your help, Blake. I know I am." Their eyes met across the table, and something unspoken passed between them. Blake reached out, his hand covering hers. "Rebecca, when this is over." Whatever he intended to say was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Blake moved quickly to the window, his expression changing to alarm. "It's Benton with 3 of Holloway's men," he said urgently. "They must have discovered we were at the ranch." Rebecca's heart raced. "How did they find us here?" "Someone in town must have talked. Quick, gather the evidence." Blake grabbed his rifle from the rack by the door. "We'll go out the back, through the trees. If we can reach town, we can make our case to Morris in public, where Holloway can't interfere. Rebecca swiftly collected the documents, securing them in her father's journal for protection. Blake checked his pistol, then handed her the shotgun she'd used the previous night. "Stay close to me," he instructed, leading her toward the back door. They slipped out just as Benton and his men reached the front of the cabin. Through the trees, Rebecca could see them dismounting, weapons drawn. "Check inside," Benton ordered. "They can't be far." Blake guided Rebecca into the dense pine forest behind the cabin, moving quietly but quickly downhill toward the creek. "If we follow the creek south, it will lead us toward town," he whispered. "The brush will provide cover." They hurried through the forest, the sound of men crashing through the underbrush behind them spurring them on. Rebecca's skirts caught on branches, slowing her progress, but she pushed forward, clutching the precious evidence to her chest. The creek came into view, a ribbon of silver winding through the trees. They splashed across at a shallow point, hoping the water would obscure their trail. On the far bank, Blake paused to listen. The sounds of pursuit seemed to be fading. "I think we've gained some distance," he said. "But they'll track us eventually. We need to reach town before they catch up." They continued south, staying near the creek but on drier ground where they could move more quickly. Rebecca's breathing was labored, her city life in St. Louis having done little to prepare her for this kind of exertion. Blake noticed her struggle and slowed his pace slightly. "Are you all right?" he asked, concern evident in his eyes. "I'll manage," she assured him, though her side ached with every breath. "How much farther?" "About 2 miles. There's a road ahead that will make travel easier, but it also leaves us more exposed." Before Rebecca could respond, the crack of a rifle split the air. A bullet splintered the trunk of a tree inches from Blake's head. "Down!" he shouted, pulling Rebecca behind a fallen log as a second shot whistled overhead. "They've found us," Rebecca gasped, clutching the shotgun. Blake peered cautiously over the log. "One of them must have circled ahead. He's on the ridge to our left." The shooter fired again, the bullet embedding itself in the log, protecting them. Blake raised his rifle and returned fire, forcing their attacker to duck behind a boulder. "We're pinned down," Blake muttered, "and the others will be catching up soon." Rebecca assessed their situation. The creek lay to their right, the ridge with the shooter to their left, dense forest behind them, and more open ground ahead. "If we stay in the creek bed, could we move forward without being seen?" Blake nodded approvingly. "Good thinking. The bank might provide enough cover if we stay low." Another shot rang out, this one from behind them. "They're closing in," Blake said grimly. "We need to move now." They scrambled down the bank into the creek, the cold water soaking Rebecca's skirts. Staying as low as possible, they moved forward, using the overhanging bank for cover. The water was only knee-deep but swift enough to make walking difficult. Rebecca slipped on a mossy stone, nearly falling before Blake caught her arm. "Almost to the bend," he encouraged. "Once we're around it, the shooter on the ridge won't have a clear sight line." They reached the curve in the creek, and Blake helped Rebecca up the bank on the far side, where trees provided additional cover. They could hear Benton shouting orders to his men, their voices still some distance behind but approaching. "The road should be just ahead," Blake said. "With luck, we might encounter a wagon or riders who can help us reach town." They pushed through underbrush, emerging onto a dirt road that ran parallel to the creek. It was empty in both directions. "Which way?" Rebecca asked, trying to catch her breath. "South. It's closer to town and farther from Benton." Blake took her elbow, supporting her as they hurried down the road. They had covered perhaps a quarter mile when the sound of hoofbeats reached them. A wagon was approaching from the south. Blake positioned himself in the middle of the road, waving his arms. The wagon appeared around a bend, a farm wagon driven by an older couple Rebecca recognized as the Petersons, who owned a small farm outside of town. "Deputy Westwood," Mr. Peterson called in surprise, reining in his team. "What in tarnation are you doing out here and in such a state?" "Mr. Peterson, we need your help," Blake said urgently. "Miss Reynolds and I are being pursued by armed men. We have evidence of serious crimes that must reach Sheriff Morris immediately." Mrs. Peterson's eyes widened at the sight of Rebecca's bedraggled appearance and the shotgun in her hands. "Good heavens! Climb aboard then, quickly." They scrambled into the back of the wagon among sacks of grain and garden tools. Mr. Peterson slapped the reins, turning the team around. "Hold tight," he called. "These old horses can still move when needed." The wagon lurched forward, picking up speed as it headed toward town. Rebecca and Blake crouched low, watching the road behind them. "You really think Sheriff Morris will help once we show him the evidence?" Rebecca asked quietly. Blake's expression was determined. "He may not want to, but with witnesses present and the evidence this clear, he'll have to act or risk his own position. Morris is Holloway's friend, but he's also a coward. He won't sacrifice himself to protect Holloway if the truth becomes public." The wagon rattled along, each minute taking them closer to safety. Rebecca found herself pressed against Blake's side, drawing comfort from his solid presence. Despite the danger, despite everything that had happened, she felt a curious sense of rightness being beside him. "Blake," she said softly, "thank you for believing me when no one else would." He looked down at her, his blue eyes intense. "Sometimes a person just knows what's true, Rebecca. From the moment I saw you reading that telegram on Main Street, I knew you were someone who deserved to be believed." The sound of galloping hooves interrupted the moment. Blake peered over the side of the wagon. "Riders coming fast behind us." Mr. Peterson urged his team to greater speed, but the farm horses were no match for the pursuing riders. Blake readied his rifle and Rebecca checked the shotgun. "Mr. Peterson," Blake called, "get your wife down. There may be shooting." The farmer nodded grimly, putting his arm around his wife to keep her low on the seat. The wagon swayed dangerously as it hit a rut in the road, nearly throwing Rebecca against the side. The riders were visible now, Benton and one of his men, spurring their horses furiously. Blake aimed carefully and fired a warning shot over their heads. "That's far enough, Benton," he shouted. "We're on our way to the sheriff with evidence of murder and cattle rustling. You'd be wise to turn back now." Benton's response was to draw his pistol and fire, the bullet splintering wood near Blake's head. Blake returned fire more deliberately this time, hitting Benton's companion in the shoulder. The man cried out, losing control of his horse, which veered off the road. Benton continued his pursuit alone, closing the distance rapidly. Rebecca raised the shotgun, waiting until he was within range. When he was less than 30 yards behind the wagon, she fired, the blast kicking dirt and gravel into the air directly in front of Benton's horse. The startled animal reared, nearly unseating its rider. By the time Benton regained control, the wagon had increased its lead significantly. "Good shot," Blake said approvingly. "My father taught me to hunt," Rebecca replied, reloading, "though we usually pursued quail, not outlaws." The road curved, revealing the outskirts of Beaver ahead. Benton had fallen back but was still in pursuit. As they entered town, people on the boardwalks turned to stare at the unusual sight, a farm wagon racing down Main Street with a woman wielding a shotgun in the back, pursued by a lone rider firing wildly. "The sheriff's office," Blake directed Mr. Peterson, who guided his team toward the building with its prominently displayed star. The wagon skidded to a stop, and Blake jumped down, helping Rebecca follow. "Get inside," he told her, positioning himself to cover her as she ran for the door. Sheriff Morris was standing on the boardwalk outside his office, drawn by the commotion. His eyes widened at the sight of Rebecca, bedraggled and armed, rushing toward him with Blake providing covering fire as Benton galloped into town. "What in God's name is happening here?" Morris demanded. "Sheriff, We have proof that Marcus Holloway ordered the murder of Henry Reynolds, Rebecca declared breathlessly, and evidence of cattle rustling across the county. Benton had reined in his horse at the far end of the street, seemingly uncertain what to do now that they had reached the sheriff. A crowd was gathering, drawn by the gunfire and commotion. "This is absurd," Morris blustered, though he looked uncomfortable as townspeople pressed closer, clearly interested in Rebecca's accusations. "Deputy Westwood, explain yourself immediately." Blake kept his rifle trained on Benton while addressing the sheriff. "We have documented evidence, including a letter from Henry Reynolds naming Holloway as a threat to his life, proof of forged property transfers, and records of cattle theft. I'm formally requesting arrest warrants for Marcus Holloway and Curtis Benton on charges of murder, fraud, and rustling." The crowd murmured, and Rebecca noticed Marcus Holloway himself pushing through to the front, his face darkening with rage as he took in the scene. "This is preposterous," Holloway declared loudly. "Sheriff, I demand you arrest these two for trespassing on my property and making slanderous accusations." "Your property," Rebecca challenged, her voice carrying clearly to the gathered crowd. "The property you stole through forgery after having my father murdered." She held up the journal and documents. "I have proof right here, my father's own words naming you as his likely killer, evidence of cattle rustling, and confirmation that the deed transfer was witnessed by a fraudulent doctor wanted in Colorado." The townspeople's murmurs grew louder. Rebecca recognized faces in the crowd: shopkeepers, ranchers, people who had known her father for years. Clara Patterson stood with her husband, their expressions shocked. Sheriff Morris looked trapped, his gaze darting between Holloway and the increasingly hostile crowd. "Now see here, everyone just calm down. These are serious accusations that require proper investigation. There's been no proper investigation because you refuse to consider the possibility that your friend Holloway could be a murderer," Blake cut in sharply. "Either do your job now, Sheriff, or I'll ride to Cedar City today and bring the territorial marshal back with me." Morris paled at the threat. The territorial marshal was known for his uncompromising approach to law enforcement and his particular dislike for corrupt local officials. Holloway, seeing the situation turning against him, changed tactics. "This is ridiculous. I purchased that property legally. Reynolds agreed to sell after years of struggling to make the ranch profitable. These forged documents they claim to have are obviously the real fraud here." "Then you won't mind if we compare the signature on the deed with known examples of Henry Reynolds' handwriting," Blake suggested smoothly. "And perhaps explain why the deed was witnessed by a man using a false identity who fled town immediately after Reynolds died." Benton, who had remained mounted at a distance, suddenly spurred his horse forward. "Boss, we need to go. Now." His urgent tone caught everyone's attention. Holloway glared at him, clearly furious at this implied admission of guilt before the entire town. Sheriff Morris finally seemed to realize he could no longer protect his friend without destroying his own position. With visible reluctance, he drew his pistol. "Marcus Holloway, Curtis Benton, I'm detaining you both pending investigation of these charges. Dismount and surrender your weapons." Benton's response was to draw his pistol and fire at the sheriff, the bullet grazing Morris's arm. Blake returned fire immediately, hitting Benton in the chest. The foreman toppled from his horse, dead before he hit the ground. In the ensuing chaos, Holloway made a desperate move, grabbing Rebecca and pulling her against him as a shield, a small derringer appearing in his hand. "Nobody move," he shouted, pressing the weapon to Rebecca's temple. "I'm riding out of here and she's coming with me." Blake lowered his rifle, his face a mask of controlled fury. "Let her go, Holloway. You won't make it out of town." "I'll kill her if anyone tries to stop me," Holloway threatened, backing toward his horse, dragging Rebecca with him. "Reynolds cost me everything with his stubbornness. His daughter won't cost me my freedom, too." Rebecca met Blake's eyes, seeing the anguish and determination there. Subtly, she shifted her weight, preparing for what she needed to do. "You murdered my father," she said clearly, wanting everyone to hear. "You stole our ranch, falsified documents, and thought no one would challenge you because of your power in this town." "Shut up," Holloway hissed, tightening his grip. "But you were wrong," Rebecca continued, her voice gaining strength, "because good people still exist in Beaver. People who believe in justice." With those words, she drove her heel down hard on Holloway's instep while simultaneously jamming her elbow into his ribs. Surprised by the sudden attack, his grip loosened enough for Rebecca to twist away. Blake didn't hesitate. As soon as Rebecca was clear, he fired. The bullet struck Holloway in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending the derringer flying from his hand. Holloway collapsed to his knees, clutching his bleeding shoulder. Sheriff Morris, nursing his own wound, moved forward with handcuffs. "Marcus Holloway, you're under arrest for the murder of Henry Reynolds, fraudulent property transfer, and cattle rustling." As the sheriff secured the prisoner, Blake rushed to Rebecca's side. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, trembling now that the danger had passed. "No, I'm fine." He pulled her gently into his arms, and she went willingly, burying her face against his chest. "I thought I'd lost you," he murmured into her hair, so softly that only she could hear. "You didn't," she whispered back. "You never will." The following weeks brought significant changes to Beaver. The territorial marshal arrived to investigate the case personally, bringing with him authorities from Colorado who had been pursuing Dr. Caldwell for years. With Benton dead and facing a mountain of evidence, Holloway eventually confessed to ordering Henry Reynolds' murder, hoping to expedite the transfer of the valuable ranch to his ownership. The forged deed was invalidated, and Rebecca's ownership of the Reynolds ranch was legally reaffirmed. Sheriff Morris, implicated in the cover-up though not in the murder itself, resigned his position in disgrace. A month after the dramatic confrontation on Main Street, Rebecca stood on the porch of her reclaimed home, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. The sound of a horse approaching drew her attention, and she smiled as Blake Westwood appeared around the bend in the drive. Since Holloway's arrest, Blake had been acting sheriff until a permanent replacement could be appointed. His handling of the Reynolds case had earned him widespread respect, and there was talk of offering him the position permanently. He dismounted and tied his horse to the rail, removing his hat as he approached the porch. "Evening, Miss Reynolds." "Sheriff Westwood," she returned, her smile widening. "Though I thought we'd agreed on Rebecca and Blake." His answering smile transformed his serious face. "Old habits, may I join you?" She gestured to the chair beside hers. "Please do." "I was just admiring the view and thinking how good it feels to be home again." "The ranch suits you," he observed, settling beside her. "I rode by the north pasture on my way here. Your new foreman has the fence repairs well in hand. Mr. Jensen is a godsend. I wouldn't be able to manage without his experience." Rebecca turned toward Blake. "Any news from the territorial court?" "Holloway's trial is set for next month in Salt Lake City. With his confession and our evidence, he'll hang for your father's murder." Blake's expression softened. "It won't bring your father back, but it's justice." "Yes," Rebecca agreed quietly. "It's what Pa would have wanted." They sat in companionable silence for a time, watching the light fade from the sky. Finally, Blake cleared his throat nervously. "Rebecca, there's something I've been meaning to ask you." She turned to him, noting the unusual uncertainty in his manner. "Yes, these past weeks, working together, getting to know you." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "I've come to admire you greatly. Your courage, your determination, your kindness." Rebecca's heart quickened. I admire you as well, Blake, more than I can say. He took her hand gently in his. When I first told you I believed your story, it was because the evidence pointed that way, and because I knew your father to be an honest man. But now, having stood beside you through all this, I believe in you for so many more reasons. Blake, she began, but he continued. I know it might seem sudden, or perhaps not proper to speak of such things when your father's murderer is only just facing justice, but life in these territories teaches a person not to waste precious time. His blue eyes met hers steadily. Rebecca Reynolds, I've fallen in love with you. Joy blossomed in her chest, bright and unexpected. And I with you, Blake Westwood. His face transformed with happiness. He brought her hand to his lips, placing a gentle kiss on her knuckles. I don't have much to offer yet. The sheriff's salary isn't substantial, and my cabin is humble compared to this fine ranch. I don't care about any of that, Rebecca assured him. When you stood on Main Street and told me you believed me when no one else would, you gave me something priceless, hope and faith when I needed it most. That's worth more than all the ranches in Utah Territory. Even so, I want to do this properly. Blake slipped from his chair to one knee before her, still holding her hand. Rebecca Reynolds, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? Tears of happiness filled Rebecca's eyes. Yes, Blake Westwood, 1,000 times yes. He rose and gathered her in his arms, his kiss gentle but filled with promise. When they finally parted, both were smiling. Your father would approve, I think, Blake said softly. He would, Rebecca agreed. He valued honesty and integrity above all else. He would have seen those qualities in you from the start. Blake looked out over the ranch that had been the center of so much drama and tragedy, now peaceful in the gathering dusk. What do you want to do with the ranch? It's a lot for one person to manage. I was thinking, Rebecca said thoughtfully, that it might do very well with two owners, a former schoolteacher and a sheriff with a talent for justice. Blake laughed, the sound warm in the evening air. I like the way you think, Miss Reynolds. Soon to be Mrs. Westwood, she reminded him with a smile. He kissed her again, and Rebecca knew with absolute certainty that this was where she belonged on her family's land, in the arms of a man who had believed in her when faith was what she needed most. 6 months later, on a crisp autumn day, Rebecca Reynolds became Rebecca Westwood in a ceremony attended by nearly everyone in Beaver. The small church overflowed with well-wishers, many of whom had witnessed the dramatic events that brought the couple together. Clara Patterson, serving as Rebecca's matron of honor, dabbed at tears as the bride and groom exchanged vows. I always knew you'd find your way back home, she whispered as she embraced Rebecca afterward. Though I never imagined the circumstances would be quite so exciting. The reception was held at the Reynolds Ranch, now the Westwood Ranch, with tables set up in the yard under cottonwood trees adorned with paper lanterns. As the sun set, casting golden light across the celebration, Blake led his bride in their first dance. Happy, Mrs. Westwood. He murmured against her ear. More than I ever thought possible, she replied truthfully. When I returned to Beaver, I expected only to reclaim my father's property. Instead, I found justice, purpose, and a love I never imagined. Blake's eyes softened. When a good woman stands up for truth, and a man puts his faith in her story, remarkable things can happen. Rebecca laughed softly. Is that poetry, Sheriff Westwood? Just the truth as I see it, he replied, spinning her gently under the lantern light. And I intend to keep believing in you every day for the rest of our lives. As they danced beneath the stars, Rebecca reflected on how a terrible loss had ultimately led to this moment of profound joy. Her father was gone, but his legacy lived on in the land they now shared, and the justice they had secured together. In a territory where a woman's word often counted for little, Blake Westwood had looked into her eyes and said, I believe you. That simple act of faith had changed everything. Together, they would build a life on this land, a life founded on truth, justice, and a love born in the most unexpected of circumstances. 2 years later, as spring returned to Beaver, Rebecca sat on the porch of their home, watching Blake show their 6-month-old son, Henry, the first wildflowers of the season. The baby's delighted laughter carried on the breeze, bringing a smile to Rebecca's face. Blake glanced up, catching her eye across the yard. The love in his expression was as clear and true as it had been the day he first told her he believed her story. With their son in his arms, he walked back to the porch, taking a seat beside her. "What are you thinking about so seriously?" he asked, settling Henry on his knee. Rebecca took her son's small hand, marveling as always at the perfect tiny fingers. "I was thinking about how differently things might have turned out if you hadn't believed me that day on Main Street." Blake nodded thoughtfully. "One moment of faith changed everything." "For both of us," she agreed, leaning over to kiss him softly. As the sun dipped toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the land that had once been stolen but was now rightfully theirs, Rebecca Westwood knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be, home, with the man who had believed in her when no one else would.